Good day and welcome to the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action. This parallel session is brought to you by our official partner, CIFAL Newcastle. In this session, we will discuss disaster risk reduction and resilience for sustainable development. So without further ado, let's proceed with our first speaker for this session. He is an associate professor at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Newcastle, no other than Dr. Iftakar Amid. Dr. Ifte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. What I will do now is basically give you an overview of DRR and resilience from a sustainable development perspective. So firstly, and remember this, I'll come back to it again, is action. What kind of action is required for DRR and integration of DRR and sustainable development? Is firstly the integrated analysis and policy setting important, and then to understand the risk, and also to implement risk-informed development based on that understanding. And then financing, number 3, integrating financing, and the private sector, which has increasingly become important, needs to be included. And then finally, inclusivity, leaving no one behind, including all kinds of people with all kinds of backgrounds and abilities. So just looking at the development and disaster context, it's firstly, we are based in Asia. All of you are. We are based in the Asia Pacific. Australia is part of the Asia Pacific region, and Asia is the most disaster-prone region. It has been documented from year after year, 2010 to the last decade. There were nearly 2,000 disasters from natural hazards, and 190 in the Philippines, where many of you are located. And also, this region is going through rapid urbanization. With urbanization, there are disparities and all forms of inequalities. And so looking further at the context, 2 things. One is that the disaster losses are rising simply because there's more economic development, there's more at stake. And secondly, these disasters derail the development. In a blink of an eye, all kinds of hard work can be undone. And then the social impact. The social impact of disaster, it exacerbates inequalities. That is very clear. And also the investment in disaster reduction is important. And it is not only to protect the gains made through development investments, but a range of other positive impacts in terms of economic, social, environmental, and the 3 dimensions actually comprise sustainable development. So I won't go into great detail about this. These are, I think, most familiar to you, the context is, and then there have been many advances, many partnerships, all kinds of efforts, all kinds of frameworks, but the challenge is massive, and it is actually getting larger, the challenge. And so some of the factors behind disaster impacts, firstly, is the different systemic risks. And looking at systemic risks, there are many factors. Firstly, disasters, they have been increasing in the region, in the Asia Pacific region. And we are looking at economic losses of more than nearly 2.5% of the region's GDP, which is a large amount of money. And then you look at last year, 2020, and this year's figures are rolling in. You can see disasters in many countries, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and so on. And they haven't yet recovered from the previous disasters, yet they're hit by a new one. And then these drivers of risk, they're contributing to exposure to a range of disasters and vulnerability, and thereby reducing capacity and so on. And all kinds of risk, and these are systemic risks, really, underlying systemic risk: poverty, inequality, gender inequality, all that, socioeconomic, political exclusion, governance challenges, so on, urbanization, climate change. So the list is a long one, and all of them actually compound and contribute to disaster risk. So looking further at systemic risks, there's a form of entanglement of the disaster and the COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment. And we see that the risk is definitely systemic, because it's, like I said, it's cascading, it's complex, interconnected, cyclical, compounded, and so on. And then you start looking at just to give you an example, extreme weather events like storms and cyclonic events and climate variability. They just eventually lead to food and water shortages and saltwater intrusions, and then leads to migration, forced migration. This is what this conference is about, really. And then COVID-19 and these disasters, they work together in tandem. They're inseparable, and they just have cascading impacts. And then you look at some of the countries so impacted by this disaster pandemic nexus. You look at countries like Indonesia. It had been hit by a tsunami in Lombok, and then it could not recover and there was the onset of the COVID pandemic. Cyclone Amphan, Bangladesh and India hit last year, and they still haven't recovered, and now there's this double whammy. And so, looking more at systemic risks, we see, and some of this is very familiar to you, is devastating impact around the world and the different measures of the government try to control it. In Australia, we've been experiencing lockdown after lockdown, for example, and the global supply chain has been disrupted, huge economic losses, particularly the air transport sector. And these impacts are disproportionately affecting poorer population groups, populations with existing vulnerabilities. And if you look at just the case of Singapore, you see the most severely affected people are migrant populations, migrant workers. United States, African American population is more severely affected by COVID-19. Yeah, so again, so just to, I will read this out, is the global extreme poverty rate rose for the first time in over 20 years. This is the latest SDG, Sustainable Development Goal report of 2021. And this says that because of COVID, really. So 119 to 124 million people, they were pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020. And 101 million children have fallen below the minimum reading proficiency level. So grim statistics, grim figures, really. So looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Development Agenda as it's known, is in this Addis Ababa action agenda, Sendai framework for disaster reduction, very important, particularly for our discussion here today. UN Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and then Paris Agreement on Climate Change, another very important framework. The urban agenda, new urban agenda, agenda for humanity, and then so on. You see, these are all UN-led frameworks which are interlinked. And so if you look at the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and you see that was also enacted in 2015, the same year as the Sustainable Development Goals were established. And you see, what does it expect? The expected goal is to reduce disaster risk and loss substantially, and loss of lives, livelihoods, health, all that. And again, relating to the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets. So there are 7 global targets and 4 priorities of action. And many of you know about these. So just simply to say that the 4 priorities relate to what I was talking about before, about understanding the risk, and secondly, about investing in risk reduction, and then good governance for risk reduction, also paying attention to recovery as a way of building back better and improvement. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, and many of you are familiar with them. So if you look at the goals and the link between disaster risk reduction and sustainable development, DRR is critical to achieving the SDGs. So that is for sure. So you see, like 90% of the disasters that happen are climate related, and they push 26 million people into poverty annually. and they cost the world economy 520 billion per year. This is an astronomical figure. So this is what we are looking at. So basically, it undoes the good work done in terms of development. And then the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that promotes resilience in DR as a foundation. It is a foundation for sustainable development. It's simply that. And it cuts across, it's cross-cutting, different aspects, different sectors of development, DRR. And DRR needs to be mainstreamed in all sectors, education, health, uh, industry, whatever, you name it, agriculture, in all sectors, it has its place. And so within the SDGs, there are 25 targets which relate to DRR in 10 of the 17 SDGs. And it shows the link of DRR. It's a core development strategy to protect and safeguard and sustainable development. And then there are calls for strengthening the capacity of all the countries, and that is important. That is what the Sendai framework tries to do, to reduce risk, decrease resilience, and adapt to climate change. All the three things have to happen together. And then the implementation part of it, it has to bundle, package DRR together with sustainable development goals. It's all together and to address climate change. So all these three things, the SDGs, DRR, and climate change adaptation, all three have to work together. It's a holy trinity, if that's the word for it. So just looking at some figures, this is from the 2021 SDGs report. And I have picked out two of the SDGs. In my opinion, these are the two most critical ones. And of course, the others are also important. But the first one is inequality within and among countries. So that is perhaps one of the most important ones. And when we look at it, just some of the figures, and you can see that the pandemic, this is what it has done. The seesaw has swung to one end. A lot of people have a lot of money. A few people have a lot of money, and a lot of people have very little. And so, and you look at the average Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient, I won't go into what it is, but if your Gini coefficient is 100, then it's perfect. And if it's 1, then it's really poor. So it's highly unequal. So you see like Gini coefficient is only 6%. So what else? I won't go into in great detail. You see, again, to relate to the theme of this conference, you see the number of refugees, and partly many of them are climate change refugees, have more than doubled since 2010. And so you look at it, just the figures, out of 100,000 persons, 311 are refugees, and all kinds of other issues. Disappearances. These were recorded in migratory routes worldwide. And many of these migratory routes are, of course, run by people smugglers who make money from poor people who are trying to escape their predicament in their own countries. So, and the second one is climate action, to take urgent action to reduce climate change and its impacts. And this is goal SDG goal 13, climate crisis, it continues. We are heading to COP26 very soon in Glasgow, and we'll see what the outcome is. But as evident from the previous COPs, nothing substantial resulted. Climate change is continuing. And you see, but the positive side is 125 out of 154 developing countries, so-called global south countries, are formulating and implementing their NAPAs, the National Climate Adaptation Plans. So National Adaptation Plan of Action, if that's the word for it. But you see some of these figures that you look at greenhouse gas emissions. This is what is happening, and this is what we should be doing to reduce the emissions. But of course, we are not getting there. And climate finance also, it's also reduced, and average annual of 48.7 billion, because even though that needs to be increased, it is still not sufficient. Okay, so now looking at some of, I mentioned that the resilience or DRR is built into the SDG targets. And you look at SDG 1, target 1.5, it talks about reducing climate-related events, disasters. SDG 2, target 2.4, strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change. And you see how all these targets relate. All the SDGs, 3, they have a target, develop early warning and reduce risk of health-related disasters. Quality education, SDG 4, again, building educational facilities that are safe from disasters. Looking at SDG 9, they develop quality and reliable infrastructure, very important for resilience. And SDG 11, of course, reduce the number of deaths in cities. And then target 13.1 in climate action. Of course, this is the obvious ones in resilience adaptive capacity. Target 15, life on land, target 15.3, SDG 15, I'm sorry, and to restore land affected by drought and floods. So you look at it. So let's look at the other framework, the Paris Agreement and the Objective Paris Climate Agreement. And you look at that, they have these two articles, Article 2, they foster climate resilience in a manner that does not threaten food production. So you're talking about basically drought-related and flood-related disasters. And then Article 7, this is to establish a global goal to enhance this adaptive capacity against climate change, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability to climate change. So you see all of these targets, all these goals, they talk about DRR, the importance of DRR. Article 8 is very clear that it has understanding, action, and support on the following: early warning systems, emergency preparedness, all related to DRR, slow onset events, and so on. So I won't go through the whole list, but you can see how strongly it has been highlighted. So this is a bit of a naming and shaming, I guess. So this was a recent rating of the action on climate change. This is in the climate action tracker. And you can see that these are some of the countries that are critically insufficient in terms of climate action. And this is 1.5 degree centigrade, reduction of 1.5 degree centigrade as laid out in the Paris Agreement by the end of the century. And you look at some of these countries, it is just Australia, highly insufficient. It's not doing very well, even though it's a prosperous, wealthy country, but they have not placed enough priority on addressing climate change. And interestingly, you see the only country that is Paris Agreement compatible is the Gambia, a poor country in the global south. So it's remarkable. And you see all these countries are wealthy countries, New Zealand, Canada, and so on, even China, but they are highly insufficient. And Philippines is also doing not terribly bad. It seems that there are 11 out of 20 almost sufficient countries. So yeah, there's work to be done. Philippines also has many challenges. It is also a global south country, but nevertheless, there is effort to address climate change. And I won't go into the definitions. You're talking about disaster resilience very quickly, that it's a system, community, society, whatever we want to call it, that can resist, absorb, accommodate, recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. So all these things, it does all that. So that is a much broader framework, the notion of resilience. What are the challenges? We have many challenges in the Asia Pacific region. It's most vulnerable to disasters. I've talked about it. Climate change is also exacerbating the disasters. The link between climate change and disasters is clearly established now, particularly hydrometeorological disaster events. Rapid urbanization, that's the other one. That region, as I said, is rapidly urbanizing. And the whole region is very far from the 2030 global targets. And 2030 is now 9 years left to achieve them. Already 6 years have gone by. And they have huge capacity gaps at different levels, institutional, community, at all levels. And they also they lack the resources to implement this global development agenda, even though there's increasing climate financing, as I mentioned, but even then, I think it is not yet sufficient. And so those were the challenges, but there are also opportunities. There's a strong economy, it's growing faster than any part of the world. So that is a positive element, that economy can be harnessed towards addressing disasters and climate change. And they also have a very strong foundation of disaster risk management. Philippines is well known for its disaster risk management policies and practices. And there are many leading projects in the Philippines that address DRR. So I'm just giving an example, but many other Asia Pacific countries have very strong foundations. I can talk about countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, which have dedicated ministries for disaster management. And then they also have, like I said, they've started integrating DR with climate change adaptation, as you can see from the climate tracker. And so, yeah, this various stakeholders, they've pushed global development agendas in the region, and then particularly so in many of the regional hubs, like in Thailand and the Philippines and Japan as well. And then the region has also made progress. They have developed cohesive frameworks, roadmaps, like I mentioned, the NAPAs. So these are the opportunities. So what happens when we have a good resilience? The outcome is lesser damage and losses, of course. Affected communities and functions, they can recover faster, earlier. So that is important. And then the investment in development that is protected and new opportunities created. And you see some of the early adopters in this area are countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, many countries in South Asia, really. So I finally come back to what I started with, what the action is required. So now you can see why I mentioned this at the beginning. So we need an integrated analysis, policy setting to understand the risk and to implement risk-informed development, and then getting the money for it, integrating the finance, the private sector into the equation, and then having an inclusive approach towards addressing it. So just to acknowledge my colleague and friend, my Filipino colleague and friend, Sani Jagilos from the United Nations Development Program in Thailand, because he shared some of these resources, particularly on the different targets. And so that's all for me. Thank you very much. Salamat po. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ifte, for very comprehensive presentation on disaster risk reduction and resilience, especially for linking DRR to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's worth noting that while we have a lot of challenges in DRR, yes, you also presented various opportunities. We'll head on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is a professor from the School of Humanities and Social Science, also at the University of Newcastle, no other than Professor Margaret Alston. Professor Margaret, please take the floor.
Thank you for the previous speaker. That was very enlightening, and you had a lot of very interesting data. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and look at some of the more social implications. So you've already put up the disaster risk reduction definition from the UN. It's aimed at preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk to strengthen resilience and therefore the achievement of sustainable development. And then sustainable development is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We've been doing a lot of research on resilience and how that can be built. So resilience is a good definition, is the capacity of individuals, families, and communities to work within their social and physical environment to absorb and withstand shocks. So where does human mobility fit in the context of DRR, resilience, and the need to forge sustainable development? And that's what I'm going to concentrate on. So how do we build the resilience in individuals, families, and communities who are impacted by disaster? And how does disaster risk reduction impact mobility? How do we ensure that actions taken in response to disasters and consequent human mobility are sustainable? These are big questions which I'm posing to you. I won't have the answers, but I think these are the types of questions that we need to look at. The context for this study is, in fact, I'm drawing on 4 studies done over a number of years. Firstly, in particular, several studies on Australian farm families who were ravaged by slow onset drought, And we've undertaken several studies in the early 2000s to now. We've also just been doing a study in the Pacific with Pacific Island families subject to catastrophic events such as cyclones and sea levels. Bangladeshi families, we looked at climate change impacts in Bangladesh in areas that were subject to flooding and cyclones. And in all of these studies, outmigration is a factor in temporarily supporting families to remain in place. So is this sustainable? A point I want to make is a really critical point, and that is that rural areas are the ones that are fairly deeply implicated. And this is where 21st century global uncertainties and policy responses will be developed. As Molnar notes, the distribution of rewards from climate change mitigation is broad and diffuse, but the distribution of costs, compromised livelihoods and community disruption often is very focused. So the opportunity for institutional recreancy through benign neglect or active exploitation of less populated locales in the conduct of climate change mitigation are many. And so this point about rural areas being particularly implicated is one I want to make. And I also want to sort of state that new leaders must emerge in this space. New policies must be developed, and sustainable development and DRR are critical in the conversation around these particular issues. So first of all, the Australian drought, and I'm going to present some brief findings with a focus on human mobility. So I've been looking for a number of years at Australian farm families who were subject to the millennium drought of 2001-2009, and again more recent dry years, 2017 and 18 in particular. So these families have been really battered by drought, a slow onset catastrophic event. And the impacts of that can be seen across rural areas with accelerated ongoing rural restructuring, economic, environmental and social disruption, farm families and farm workers moving away. So huge human mobility happening in those areas during the drought years. Decline in infrastructure, there were a lot of job losses, a lot of health stresses, and a phenomenon that we're looking at, which the phrase has been coined solastasia, which is that huge heartache that people get from watching their familiar surroundings gradually die and change. And we see a lot of people suffering from solastasia. So focusing on the conference theme, outmigration is a significant factor for a lot of the families in these particular regions, and critically the need for off-farm employment to enable families to remain farming is very evident during droughts. And the critical feature of Australian farm families, though, is that it's more likely to be women who move away for work, either in the local community or a regional centre. And this may require them living away from home during the week and moving their children to new schools to be near their mother. So this phenomenon that developed during the drought years is quite a different take on human mobility in response to disaster. And I just wanted to raise it to show a first world perspective on this particular issue as I've observed it in Australia. So just some quotes from people who took part in some of our research. One woman said there'd be any number of farmers around here still farming purely because their wife is working outside the farm. I think it's the only reason they're still farming. And another man said, I recognise the importance of the wife's off-farm income terribly. These astronomical are words. It's important. It's extremely important. Our kids wouldn't be getting the education they're getting if their mum wasn't doing what she's doing and continuing to do. It's the driving force for both of us. I always knew that she would be working off farm, that's who she is, but I didn't expect that we would be relying on it. So that phenomena of human mobility and what happens as a result was just something I wanted to raise in that particular context. We also undertook a significant study in Bangladesh where we looked at the gendered impacts of climate disasters in 3 different areas of the country. And we undertook field work in a number of isolated rural communities spread across Bangladesh, and spent a number of visits over a number of years to do this work. The social impacts that we saw in the crisis period following disasters included high mortality and morbidity, food and water insecurity, poor sanitation, and the one, of course, that we're highlighting in this conference, displacement and outmigration of people to source alternative income, and family destabilization, infrastructure destroyed, difficulties accessing services, etc., significant health impacts and interrupted education. So the point I wanted to highlight, though, was in response to disasters, this critical issue of outmigration and the social implications of that. And that includes changes in livelihood and adaptation strategies around income and work distribution, outmigration for work, as well as climate change, refugees moving away from their homes, and the reliance on remittance income across the regions that we studied was very evident. This often means males going to construction sites, driving tuk-tuks, etc., and women and young girls going to garment factories and labouring, etc. So this move for outmigration, or particularly the phenomenon of remittance income, is really causing quite significant social movements, and a lot of it generated by the climate issues. Whenever you go through an airport in Dhaka, you will see scenes like this with usually men moving, relocating often to the Middle East. And yeah, so this big decision that families have to make. And as one man said, sometimes we migrate for work, sometimes we do not. There's so many things to worry about. If we leave, then our children and wives stay home on their own. So this is complicated social arrangements that cause significant stresses for families. This one that I wanted to present to you is about the Pacific Island countries in our study that we're undertaking in Vanuatu, looking at access to climate information. And climate changes in the islands, of course, are significant and widespread. And then on top of that, they've had COVID and the loss of tourism, which has created significant financial stresses. So COVID on top of climate changes is really having significant impacts. And of course, one of the factors that is very evident is this outmigration, significant source of remittance income that occurs. And men and women in the Pacific will go to neighbouring countries like Australia, and men in particular come to Australia to work in agriculture, picking fruit. And so it's seasonal work, and they have visas that allow them to come seasonally, but not to stay in the country. So meanwhile, back at their homes, it's often women then who are looking after their agricultural plots and keeping the home going. And we spoke to a lot of women who'd experienced disasters when they're on their own, and that has significant impacts on their lives. So just to sum up, the common adaptations in these studies are changes in livelihood and adaptation strategies, particularly around income and work distribution, who's doing what, who's sourcing remittance income elsewhere, who then is having to take up the work redistribution back home. Outmigration and indeed displacement is common across cultures that we've looked at. Wage labour is the most common adaptation, and that can mean men moving away like the Pacific and Bangladesh. It could mean women working closer to home but going out to work nonetheless. It can mean young women going to garment factories in Bangladesh or into tourism jobs in the Pacific. In Australian farm families, it can mean women moving away to source income elsewhere. There's also the common element of people getting loans to cover over the disaster period. We also note in all of the communities that we go into, this practice of community capacity building is often done by women in local communities. So one of the issues that I wanted to stress is that there are very poor policy responses in relation to the social issues around climate change. So climate change events are often treated, certainly in Australia, as a market failure rather than a social crisis. And this can create disaffection and alienation, and unpredictability of climate events creates huge uncertainty for families about whether these changes they're making in their lives are in fact permanent or whether they're temporary, and decisions need to be made about that. But policy neglects the social complexities of these uncertainties. Outmigration is indeed a critical resilience strategy, and disaster risk reduction and localised resilience building factors that really need to be considered in these changing communities. I wanted to finish by talking about the South Asia Women's Resilience Index, which I had some input into. This was an index developed by ActionAid, DFAT and EIU. I was involved in being on the board of this and undertaking follow-up interviews, and I had a PhD student who worked on the project. So I'm presenting it because it's quite an interesting look at resilience and building resilience. So the motivation for the Women's Resilience Index were the increasing number of disasters, whether they be natural, economic or conflict, and disaster risk reduction and resilience building were priorities for the development of this project. The inclusion of women was seen as absolutely critical, and assessment of barriers to their involvement were what we were looking at. So then we came up with the development of indicators, economic, infrastructure, institutional and social indicators. So looking at what resilience building, what can facilitate that. So we realise that there's a need to recognise women's greater vulnerability and capacity to lead disaster resilience efforts. So I've seen that particularly in the Pacific in recent times, where women are leading resilience efforts, and I see that in a number of places that we go to. Decentralised disaster planning was one of the issues that one of the factors that the index outlined. The need to empower women to build disaster resilience at community level is evident in all of the studies that we've seen. And there's a need to emphasise women's capacity for leadership and to match DRR and resilience building with much broader efforts for poverty alleviation and sustainable development. So just bringing it all together, the current approach to climate change adaptation is one of very much of global managerialism. And this perspective portrays adaptation as adjustments to the predicted impacts of climate change. It frames solutions in technical, economic, and managerial terms. It presumes that enhanced climate science will result in the reduction of uncertainties. It prioritizes expert knowledge about the future, allows for the selection of optimal adaptation strategies. It's linear, apolitical, and has self-limiting trajectories. It generates lists and inventories of readily available and discrete adaptation options, and adheres to a strong belief in the ubiquitous usefulness of science products for disasters. So you can see I'm not quite fond of that particular approach. We need to change that. So what is needed is community and individual resilience, a focus on this, social support, social, environmental, and gender justice, and gender equality being at the heart of the efforts that as we go forward. We need policy shaped around social equity and sustainability, as well as environmental and economic concerns. And I just wanted to put this quote up as my final slide. It was a quote that one of the women in our focus groups in the Pacific said to us. She said, "We are women of resilience. Try to push us down, but we try to come back up and stand our ground. We come to sit and listen and contribute to global-wide issues. We will be here. We will wait for your return so we can move forward as to how to address these issues that affect our future." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Margaret Alston, especially for highlighting outmigration and displacement as consequences of the current climate crisis, as well as the role of DRR in the broader efforts for sustainable development. And now the floor is open for questions from our participants. Maybe just to jump up our discussion, we have one private question for both Professor Margaret Alston and Professor Iftakar Amid. One of the participants asks, what are some examples of DRR strategies that are inclusive for climate migrants in areas of this destination as well as in areas of origins? I think they are asking for maybe a specific example, or if there's an example in a particular country or city, maybe you can share that.
I'm sorry, I missed the question, the first part of the question. Examples of?
DRR strategies that are inclusive for climate migrants in areas of destination as well as those in their area of origin.
I could probably refer off the top of my head to the Pacific workers who come to Australia, and there are a number of policy, legislation around supporting those workers and what sort of infrastructure is needed to support them. So there's lots of rules and regulations around that. There's lots of checking to make sure that they're not being exploited, etc. So, I mean, that's an example that springs to mind.
Can I just add very quickly? I think I really don't have any examples, and particularly in the Asia Pacific region, governance has largely been anti-climate refugees and migrants. So that is the general case. Unfortunately, that is another grim picture. But there was another question in the chat box, which is quite interesting. I think someone called Maria, she posed a question about Bhutan. And Bhutan is a South Asian country, and some of you may not know where it is. And interestingly, you can read my recent book, Disaster Resilience in South Asia. It's published last year, and Bhutan is one of the case studies. I had the opportunity to go there several times, and Bhutan actually has the target of keeping 60% of its country under forest cover. And it is in the range of 80%. So it is great. It is a good example. The only problem is that it's not in the climate tracker is because the data is not ready yet. So these are the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for climate change. So climate change emissions reduction rather. So their data will be ready in 2022. The latest data they have is from 2015. So it's still not updated, but it is definitely a great example. But they are under a lot of pressure also from the surrounding countries. They're squeezed between China on one side and India on the other. And you can see that they are like, it's unbelievable. The kind of stuff that they do is just not recorded so much in the media. It's for example, they actually supply hydroelectric power to India, and the whole country is based on hydroelectric power. So there are many other examples that they have all kinds of policies. So yeah, so and I actually shared a link from the climate target tracker on Bhutan, and that gives an overview of the NDC planning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ifte and Professor Margaret Alston. Maybe we have some questions from our participants. You can actually raise your hand and we will recognize you so you can speak directly to our experts. Or if you want, you can still key in our chat box your questions or comments about the discussion. Okay. Do we have any questions or concerns from our participants? Okay, so I think I have another one here. We have another question right here. It's a private question, I think. The question is, how do we ensure that we have a community-led disaster risk reduction? Yeah. Maybe either of our experts can respond to that.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's a little bit like, which comes first, the cart or the horse? Because from my observation, community-led disaster risk reduction efforts are underway anyway, and the big point is we need to facilitate those. So in all of the areas that I've gone into, there's been things happen at community level, as simple as organising meetings to get people together when they're incredibly stressed. So those sort of efforts are happening anyway. What's not happening is the resourcing of that as a matter of course, so there's a real need to fund community level actions, in my view. And I think that should be the next step of where we go from here.
And just to add to that, and as Professor Alston mentioned, it is part of the protocols of almost all NGOs to do that kind of work. They are engaged, they're doing it already in many countries, and even the governments in some countries are supporting that process. I mean, things have moved quite a bit in that, not relating to climate migrants or refugees, but in overall practice of DRR and development. They actually they rest on the shoulders of the community. They cannot be implemented otherwise, simply that. Just to give you a little example, this is a very specific example. I was recently involved in a project in Vanuatu, looking at what they call shelter self-recovery. Now, what had happened in the past is that after a disaster, humanitarian organizations would go in and provide support and build homes, shelter for people. But this has been found to be counterproductive because very often the quality isn't that great and it's quite expensive and all that. So now what these organizations started doing is to support the self-recovery process. In many cases, they found that by the time they would go to a community, 60% of them have recovered to some extent. I mean, not exactly ideal, but they have recovered to some extent. The train had already left the station. So now what they are really trying to do is to support the self-recovery process instead of doing recovery in terms of capacity building, training, engagement of more women in the construction sector, and so on, and providing some ideas on how to build back better, how to build more resilient buildings. So I'm happy to share the report if anyone is interested. So that is just an example of how community-led DRR can be implemented.
Thank you again to our experts. Very informative. Maybe Dr. Ifte can share with us the report that you mentioned. I think that will be very helpful as one of our references for our participants. So we have maybe we can entertain one last question from our participants. Do we have anyone who wants to directly address our speakers for this afternoon? Okay, so I have here one last question from another participant. Is there an opportunity for public-private partnership when it comes to developing DRR strategies? And if so, what are the best practices for such a partnership?
Interesting. I think there's certainly room for public-private partnerships as long as they're directing their efforts to communities and being controlled by communities. So I think there's always room for that, in my view. I'm not quite sure if I've got the thrust of your question, but yes, that would be my response.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that. I think the notion of corporate social responsibility that kicks in, and many organizations are private sector organizations, companies, they are now doing CSR as part of their regular work. And through that, many of them actually invest in sustainable development. Just last week, I had a former student of ours who gave a guest lecture in my class, and she works in the private sector. And she showed how her company is actually investing in the SDGs through their work. So definitely it is important for many of these organizations simply because they need to safeguard the investments. And in order to safeguard the investment, they are willing to invest that extra money. And there's been a lot of rhetoric now about including the private sector, as you saw in my slides. And the United Nations very clearly now, and UNDRR, for example, very clearly identifies the private sector as a key partner in DRR and sustainable development. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yes, that's very interesting, Dr. Ifte. Very interesting, actually, because we do have the Global Compact, the United Nations Global Compact, which highlights corporate sustainability for businesses. So that's really for businesses. So it actually has 10 principles with 4 major themes, and that includes environment and human rights. So that's it's very interesting how the corporate or big businesses and even small medium enterprises are now engaged in highlighting mainstreaming SDGs in their endeavors in the private sector. Now, thank you very much to our experts, Professor Margaret Alston and Dr. Iftakar Amid, for such comprehensive discussion on disaster risk reduction and resilience for sustainable development.